Welcome back to Punching Up. I am your host, Maya May, and we are in for a good show tonight because we have Victor Shi with us. And tonight we're going to be talking about the perception election. That's what I'm going to call it because people voted off of what they perceive, not necessarily reality. And that is perhaps true on the Trump voter side, but it's also true on the Democratic side because this was a lot about vibes. And so for those of us who were riding the vibes and hoping to convert those into votes, a lot of us were believing that that was actually happening when in fact, as we saw, it did not. And so perception is something that I've been thinking a lot about and reflecting a lot about. And that's why I'm glad Victor Shi is on with us because he was with me on the vibes to votes train. And we were doing everything that we could to do that. And so I think it's time to have a little post-mortem to figure out what went wrong, if anything at all. But we know something did go wrong because otherwise we would have won. But we're going to analyze what went wrong and what we can change about how we approach things going into the next election cycle. But also, it's always election season. That's what I want to say. So from now through forever, we're going to talk about how we're going to change things up. So with that being said, let's bring to the show Victor Shi. Victor!
Hi, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for having me. And I love the blue sky. Now that we're moving off of Twitter, I like how the blue sky handles there. So thank you.
Oh, yes. Blue sky. When you talk about perception, the world feels a lot nicer on blue sky than it does on Twitter. I look at
Absolutely.
going into Twitter it's like I'm going into the dark place and doing my
Yeah,
shadow
yeah,
work when I go into Twitter. And it feels like blue sky is where we can actually solve problems.
absolutely. I totally agree.
So you and I, last time we saw each other was at the DNC. The vibes were good. Everybody was like, we're feeling it. I was cheerleading right along with you with all of the Twitter posts. And I think like vibes are incredibly important. Like that was important to get people engaged and get people out to the polls. But something went wrong. Can we talk about it? You were the youth engagement communications lead for the Kamala Harris campaign. So, can you talk a little bit about what that felt like on the ground as you were trying to get people engaged, but at the same time also maybe looking at the numbers and going, maybe we're not quite there yet?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think this election was so much about vibes, and I think it's really important to understand. Like, there's never been an election like this before, where I joined the campaign back in April of this year, and halfway through, basically, Biden dropped out after, of course, that debate performance, and then Kamala Harris stepped in with basically 107 days, is what people have been saying, and technically that's true. But when you take a look at sort of when votes first started getting cast, it was really 90 something days. I mean, she had a very limited time to sell herself to American people. But at the same time, I think that's where a lot of the challenges came into play. And it's a really tough situation to be when you're on a campaign. But I think there's these sort of two different realities. And like you said, I think there's the vibes that we all sort of felt. You know, the DNC was a great encapsulation of that. So were all the rallies. You know, it was just energetic. They were packed to the brim. All of them were just so high energy. But at the same time, there was a different segment of the American people that I don't think that we paid enough attention to. And for me, and when you look at sort of young people, that was young men. And these were trends that we started, at least I started seeing early on in the campaign. I mean, it was poll after poll showing that young men specifically, while they agreed with the Democratic Party in terms of values, so on issues like expanding healthcare, on issues like combating gun violence, they didn't agree with our brand. They didn't really feel like they were a part of sort of the image that we were trying to build, for better for worse. They still were nostalgic about a past time when Trump was elected. They thought the economy was better under Trump, which, you know, we can talk about how false that is. But there is this general perception among people that, you know, they from when Biden was running, that they didn't quite feel attached to the Democratic Party. And I think that sort of continued over during the Harris campaign. And a lot of the things I think that contributed to that, and we can talk more about that during this recording, is just how big of a role this media information ecosystem plays, and how Republicans have really dominated it in a way that Democrats haven't. And I think that that lends itself to reaching people like young men and some of the people who don't really traditionally follow politics. And Republicans were able to do that so much better than we were. And I think it's something that we have to definitely learn. But I think in short, you know, it was a tough campaign. I think circumstances were near impossible, but they did the most with what they could, I think.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you highlighted the very shortened time span that everybody
Yeah.
had to work with to ramp things up. And we did try. I want to talk about the Gen Z influencers and how perhaps we could have better supported the work they were doing, or maybe like the Harry Sissons of the world. Like we had all of these young men, I think Parker Malloy, there were several of them, and they created a lot of content. They did debates on Twitter, they did live debates on TikTok. What do you think they were speaking to the wrong segment of young men? Where do you think they could have changed up their strategy?
Yeah, I don't know if they were speaking to the wrong segment of young men, and they did what they could for sure, and they were on TikTok and they were on all these newer platforms. I think part of it is that a lot of these things end up being echo chambers. I think, and it's like sort of we have influencers like that, but we don't have the type of funding to give those influencers the support they need to go sort of beyond those echo chambers, right? And I think it takes a lot of time when you look at sort of what the other side has done when it comes to building up their influencer strategy and building up their influencer program. It's very sustained and very, I think there's a lot of funding for it in a way that we just don't have on our side. And I think there's a clear pipeline from, your influencer in Georgia to a place like Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA. Like they have that infrastructure built in a way that we don't. And so I think that, the Harrys of the world, I think matter. And I think that, the more funding we can give them, the better it will become. But it's just, I think, a matter of we're sort of playing catch up, and we are miles behind, I think, where Republicans are. But it takes 100 Harrys, I think, to make it work. But right now, we don't have many people like him and who are sort of a part of that ecosystem who can push those messages out there in a coordinated and consistent way.
Yeah, like unfortunately, we have the Harrys competing with the Andrew Tates of the world, who,
Exactly.
by the way, JD Vance now follows on Twitter, which is still shocking to me. Those of you who don't know who Andrew Tate is, he is a right wing influencer who was credibly accused of sex trafficking and was on house arrest in Romania for quite some time. He and his brother, and our vice president elect follows him on Twitter and only follows, I think, 1,000 or so people. So that's definitely intentional and purposeful, and probably a nod to how influential the right wing influencers were during this election cycle. So to me,
Absolutely.
it's like, and when you talk about funding, we're trying to compete with apparently the tenant medias and the Russian dollars of the world in our elections as well. So that makes it incredibly difficult. Victor, did you have to move to an undisclosed location? Are
I
you in a
did. I
server
did.
room somewhere?
I did. I'm currently based in Chicago, and I was in a room before, but then my sessions ran out, so I'm currently in this sort of space where it looks like I have servers behind me, and there actually are servers, which is quite intense.
I know. I was like, as I say, I feel like you're doing research and finding out where the Russian hackers might be if they're tapping in right there. I was like, I need to know about
Yes.
this
Yeah.
secret Victor Shi life. So, speaking of online servers, virtual, I actually want to pivot and talk about messaging. And on one hand, I'm like, it's on us as citizens to be engaged and to go to the websites and research the policies. And so, for
Yeah.
part of me,
Yeah.
doesn't want to let the average citizen off the hook, because
Yeah.
like everybody was
Yeah.
saying about Mangione, we could find everything there is about Luigi, but you couldn't find Kamala Harris's economic policies, you couldn't find her plans. And so but again, I think that goes to what you said earlier about brand. And so when in what people are perceiving about what the Kamala Harris brand is. And so what did you hear from people? Because I can tell you what I heard when I was knocking on doors and when I phone banked, but I'd love to hear what you heard from people, who they understood that she is.
Yeah, so of course, I was primarily a lot of my work on the campaign was primarily targeted at young people, and one of the things I heard time and time again, while there were more young people, and I have to say, when Biden dropped out and when Kamala stepped in, it was night and day between a lot of the young people who I was talking to. There was the sense of hope, there was a sense of joy from so many more young people, but at the same time, I still felt that sense from young people that they didn't quite know who she was. I think that was the biggest thing is like they didn't quite know who she was. And then also, why should they participate in this election and what is going for them in this system? And I think a lot of people are still very dispirited by this sort of two-party system we have. A lot of people aren't quite satisfied with both candidates. I heard a lot about sort of the fact, that for, whether or not this has any merits, that she wasn't doing enough to support Gaza and that she wasn't doing enough to combat, a lot of the special interest groups. And so there was a lot that people felt like she could have done more. But at the same time, like, again, this is a 107-day campaign. She only could do so much in those 107 days and sell herself to the American people in the way that she did. But at least from the people who I was hearing from, it seemed to be either that they didn't know who she was, they didn't quite know what the changes that she would offer, or that they wanted to see her do more, or that they were just totally disillusioned by the system, or didn't want to participate whatsoever in this election because it was just they saw two of the same people running again. Which for any of us who are in politics, we know how much different Kamala Harris was, and what her campaign represented, and how new and refreshing and just inspiring that was for people who never really got to see those type of candidates in their lifetime. I mean, it was a special campaign, but didn't quite seep through to some of the people who I was talking to, I would say.
Which is incredibly frustrating. Even as I was trying
Yeah.
to, a lot of the content I made was about like both sides are not the same. Like I felt like
Yes.
I was
Yes.
screaming into the void at people wanting to like flip things over. I'm like, how can you not look at these two things? And it was incredibly frustrating because the results of the election are absolutely devastating and have serious consequences for Gen Z. And yet Gen Z turnout was down in this election cycle. And so, as far as variables that we've talked about that attribute to that, it's not knowing necessarily what her message is or not buying the brand. But what about voter suppression? Polling locations being closed on college campuses.
Yeah.
Can you talk about other variables that you feel had an impact?
Yeah, I mean, like this was something that we were tracking back. I mean, like I was tracking at least back after 2020. I mean, Republicans have spent so long suppressing the vote, and even before 20. I mean, like this is not new what Republicans have been trying to do, but it sort of shifted after the 2020 election to try to target young people specifically with stricter voter ID requirements. If you're a college student on a campus, they would limit the amount of polling centers on a college campus to maybe only one or none at all, so that students would have to go to 20 minutes away, and that's hard if you don't have a car, if you don't have reliable public transportation in your college town. So they would try to do these things, and it was piecemeal, and they would do one thing and they would do the next thing, and then it would end up being this whole voter suppression tactic and effort that would make it so much harder for young people to turn out and vote. And I think we saw that in some places in this election. So you look at a place like Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania has a
Mm.
bunch of college campuses, and some of the lines that were stretching around the block during election day were 3, 4 hours long. I mean, that's part of their effort, is to get young people to vote in these 4 or 5 hour lines. And then you find those young people who are like, I don't want to vote in that line. It's too long for me to spend 5 hours of my day participating and just casting my ballot. But that's part of their goal here. And so I think that there is definitely a lot of voter suppression out there targeted specifically at minority communities, of course, right? I mean, Black
Mm.
people specifically, but young people too. And it's something that we're going to really have to take on. And so I'm grateful for the Marco Eliases of the world. But again, it's something on our side where we don't have that many people who are taking this on. And we definitely need a lot more to take on these challenges as we head into the coming elections.
Yeah, that and the disinformation and I'll say misinformation that we saw on TikTok. And even
Yeah.
I'm curious what you thought about like the comment section on different videos, because a lot of times I had to ask myself, is this a genuine person saying this? Is this a bot? Do you think the comment section had an effect?
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't thought too much about the comment section, but you're right in terms of some of the most sort of high profile videos that we would post, or some of the on TikTok, Instagram, what be it, they were flooded with a bunch of negative comments. And while there were a bunch of likes, there were also a bunch of just trolls out on there, whether especially on X, but also on TikTok. And I think that does play an influence. I mean, when you go to the comment section, you start reading all of these negative comments. For you find that one person who might read those comments and then end up changing their mind or having a different perception of our party. And I think it's part of that, the other side's apparatus, is to flood the zone with all of these comments to get those, to get maybe once just people on the fence to move to the other side. And so I think it definitely has a small role to play. I don't know the people who are already sort of involved in politics, who already have made up their minds. I don't know how much of a difference it has for them, but for maybe people on the fence, it made a difference. And I definitely think that the comment section is just, I mean, it's the cesspool of humanity. There's so much vitriol that's happening there. But again, I think it's a part of their strategy to intentionally target those type of videos to get people to rethink their beliefs.
Yeah, rethink them or just tune out altogether and say, hey, this is
Totally. Yes.
toxic.
Yes.
And so,
Yep.
because we know that all of these elections, the margins are very, very small. And so, even if it picks
Absolutely.
off one person here, one person there, cumulatively, it ends up making a difference. And so, that's why I'm hoping Blue Sky is a part of the apparatus in the future. But also, I think in person. I'm so big on in person events. And so I want to talk about Turning Point, Charlie Kirk, all of their in person events that they have for Gen Z. They make them fun. They have like America Fest or Amerifest or whatever it's called. And they travel the country and bring people together. It's hard
Yeah.
to say how attended those were, and how people were attending. But can you talk about anything that we have going on like that for either Gen Z or just people? Oh, because there's rallies are one thing, but these were more like conferences and
Yeah. Yeah.
get-togethers.
Totally. You're so right. And it's something that I think we have to do a lot better on our side. And there's this whole notion, I think, among a lot of people that young people don't really want to do anything in person. They're much more online. And I don't think that's true at all. There is a lot of hunger to see uh, people who, young people admire. I mean, you take a look at, I want to say Alex Cooper, right? Alex Cooper, she started doing these in-person events on college campuses near, towns that were filled with young people, and they were packed. I mean, it was one of the most popular things that she said that she did. And young people want to see those type of things because at the end of the day, young people crave community. I think that it's something that people don't realize that we're not just online. We crave those in-person interactions. And I think that what Turning Point USA tries to do with their conferences is to build that community. That's why the people there and the people who
Mhm.
are part of that network are so engaged in a way that really we don't have. But again, it's that type of funding that goes into Turning Point USA. It's those billionaires and millionaires that fund
Mhm.
moments like that that can they can go to a college campus, rent out an auditorium, and allow young people to go there for free, right? And I think that's another part of it is that they don't charge money to for young people to see someone like Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro. It's like anyone can go at $0, and I think that makes a difference for young people who are struggling to pay rent and struggling to find a job. I think that allows them to be a part of a community that they don't have to sort of buy into. And I think our side definitely needs that sort of pipeline and sort of system. I don't know what that quite looks like if we don't have the resources, but definitely need, I think, first money to help fund that operation, but definitely doing things like town halls and Q&A sessions. And
Mhm.
I think candidates, we can start even with elected officials doing their town halls on college campuses and showing up in their communities in a different way, not just, at churches or at these community centers, but going specifically and reaching young people where they're at, I think would be a great start. But I think the bottom line, I think, is building that sense of community, giving young people that sort of buy-in into a space that is comfortable and that they feel familiar with. And then you sort of increase the incentive structure and the permission structure to get involved in politics. And I think that's the biggest thing that we have to grapple with as a party, sort of, if we want to bring in more young people going forward.
I'm so glad that you highlighted the fact that young people do want community and do
Yeah.
want to be in person in community. And do you think that part of the reason, and I think this is such a great idea that I'm shocked now that that people haven't done it. When you mentioned politicians having town halls and getting on college campuses, and I mean they have a captive audience, if you will, in a way.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
know at my daughter's high school, I think like the person who was running for water commissioner came to the high school, and
Oh my
that's how I
gosh.
found out who that person was. And so
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
can be done. Why do you think, short of funding, do you think it's because maybe they assume that Gen Z is not going to vote? Why aren't politicians on college campuses nonstop? Because that is a great idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of it might just be they don't think they can draw an audience or that they've never done it before, and so they view it as a risk. But it's definitely something that I wish a lot more politicians would do, and especially the I think the up and coming elected officials that we have are the people who are on the younger side. I mean, we have so many talented people in the Democratic Party who I don't think that people know about. And one of the ways that you sort of introduce yourself is you start going to places where people don't expect you to go, and part of that can be colleges and universities. And I think that will showcase to a lot more people sort of the talent that we have in our party. Because I can tell you, I mean, if you were to sample 100 college kids and whether or not they would know people like Lauren Underwood or Greg Casar or some of the rising stars we have in this party, I bet most of them wouldn't know them. But I think it starts by them going to the places where young people are. And yes, that includes social media, but it also really includes town halls. And you can also stream those town halls on like Facebook, on Twitter, Twitter, on Instagram, wherever that might be. But there's a way to make those things bigger. But Republicans have done that so much earlier and more intensely than our side with organizations like Turning Point, with Prager University, all of these different organizations that they have. They've really targeted colleges and universities in a way that we haven't. But we can start, of course, now and earlier than we have in the past.
So, and I'm glad because timing is everything. And so the time I say it's always election season. The time
Yeah.
is now to build that community and connections. And so what are we talking about? Like maybe pickleball for politics? Like what are the events that people will come out to? And then we can just like slip in a little bit of the politics. Pub quiz trivia. I love a little, do the youth like trivia? I don't know what's happening with the youth anymore. What do the youth like, Victor? What do they need?
Yeah, I think it's hearing from both, people who they haven't heard from before, but also trusted messengers. And I think, of course, sports is one of the biggest things. I think getting
Mm,
politicians. I think there was a moment when this election. Down in Florida, sorry, down in Texas, when Colin Allred went to a tailgate. Tim Walz did that
mm,
really well, I think, in this election. Getting politicians to do just normal human things, I think, is really important, and just allowing them to, take off that sort of polished, scripted version and allow them to be humans, I think, is so important. And then shows young people that they're willing to show up in their spaces. They're willing to engage with them in a way that they don't traditionally see. Westmore did that too, with the mayor of Cincinnati, who I'm looking, Aftab, I think is his name. But there are
mm,
there's so many instances of politicians who are starting to do that. And I think having people like AOC go on Twitch and all of these different gaming platforms would help a
mm.
lot too. But doing the things that young people care about, sports, gaming, going online, going in person, going to, parties and having a good time with young people, all of those things matter, but it's just showing up in a way and starting to show people that, yes, we will engage with you in a way that, is relevant to your life and that shows up and that is, it matters to you. And I think that is something that we don't quite see from Democratic politicians, as much as we see from Republicans.
Yeah, and when you talk about funding for these events and making it possible, I know a lot of people listening might be like, "But Kamala Harris's campaign raised so much money. They raised so much money.
Yeah.
Where did this money go?" Can we talk about this a little bit, just so people have a better understanding of where this gets distributed?
Yeah, well, so I know that I don't know sort of where every dollar went for the campaign, but generally there are sort of a few ways that the money gets spent. And from my understanding, it was a lot for, so there's the Kamala campaign HQ, which is in Delaware, but then all across battleground states, there are campaign offices set up. And so part of it is meant to fund efforts in Arizona and all across our battleground states and their on the ground efforts. Another part of it is to help sort of the down ballot races. So the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Committee, it's to help the Senate Committee, it's to help the DNC. So a lot of that money is shared. And there's also money that's sort of spent and just on, advertisements and paid media. And one moment was, and this was a bit controversial, but whether or not we needed to spend $1 million on the Sphere in Las Vegas, Nevada. So there's all these different moments that the campaign spends, and of course, rallies and paying for venues and staff as well across all the battleground states. We had, I think, about 3,500 staff spread across the entire country. So all of them had to get paid. So it's a lot of different buckets that the campaign had to spend on. But I think this election was unique in the sense that when you have 107 days, you have to be more intense on all of the different cylinders. You have to spend so much
Mm-hmm.
more money on paid media. You have to spend so much more money on ground game to get those messages out there. So I think that this campaign was definitely a different beast. But at the end of the day, of course, I think it's a matter of where that money went. And a lot of people are asking those questions of, like, did we have to spend $1 million on the Sphere? Did we have to spend 100,000, 200,000 on an Alex Cooper set, if that's true, if the reporting is true on that? I think there's a lot of questions that are being raised, and especially for consultants and paying outside groups to help us. Like those are all things that we can debate over, but there are some things where it's like we had to ramp up our paid media, we had to ramp up our ground game operation. The only way that we would be able to do that is through more funding, I think.
No, I agree with you 100%. And I think we're also in an environment where Trump and his shenanigans attracted so much earned media. He bragged about the fact that he got so much free advertising. I'm like, well, yeah, because you're a chaos junkie. And so,
Yes.
of course, the media wants to cover the circus. And Kamala
Yeah.
Harris, to be taken as a serious candidate, obviously can't do those sorts of things to attract attention to her campaign. And so I think investments like $1 million for the Sphere was probably a good idea because that ended up attracting quite a bit of earned media and
Hmm.
attention that she might not have gotten otherwise. And so it's really difficult
100%.
to calculate those things. And so I want
Yeah.
people to be mindful and keep that in mind of how vastly expensive it is to build out an operation so very quickly like
Yeah.
that. And when I went to Canvas with a group they were busing people from Los Angeles to Nevada, and I mean, it was buses and bagels to feed the people because it was a long ride, and it's like
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
this stuff costs money that we might not necessarily think about it. And so, yes, how that money gets apportioned in the future might shift and change. And I obviously would love to see more creators get an
100%.
opportunity
Yep.
because what I think a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the creators, they don't do it full time, so they do it on
Yeah.
top
Yeah.
of school, on top of their
Hmm.
jobs, and
Hmm.
so in order to have well researched, meaningful, scalable content that takes time. And so I know a lot of us left it all on the floor. I was talking
100%. Yeah.
about that last week, and so can you talk a little bit going forward about how you are building up your energy reserves and how people can build up their energy reserves and the silver linings that you're seeing and what can kind of help get us motivated again, get the
Yeah.
vibes back up.
I just want to say thank you for all that you did, and I know Resolute Square and Lincoln Project, and just the entire sort of network and community that you built mattered so much, and you gave it 100%, and so did, like you said, everyone else. Everyone who I've talked to just spent so much time creating content, pumping out content. I mean, it mattered. It all mattered, and I think that we wouldn't be able, like, it was not a mandate election. There was not this wide Trump victory. It was still a close election. We got to that point because of people like you and people all across the country doing their part. But I think going forward, I actually am optimistic for a few reasons. I think the first is something that I mentioned before, which is that we have a very talented bench within the Democratic Party. 2028, 2026, and even 2025, we have some great gubernatorial elections. Spamberger in Virginia, we have a few great candidates already running in New Jersey. 2026 is going to be a really great election too. 2028, I mean, people who are, they haven't announced yet, but I'm looking at people like potentially Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Wes Moore, all of these people who are so talented, who can really rise on a national stage that I think will be stronger for that. The other part that I'm really optimistic about is when we talk about new media, yes, we are behind. But Republicans have spent so long building their media operation. I mean, you look at sort of the distrust in media that has been happening over the past few decades. It's both parties that now distrust legacy media. And the only way out of that is for newer content creators and media outlets to come out of that. And so I think that there will be more media outlets on our side, partly because we don't really have that many on our side to begin with. But the ones on their side are already so established, there's not much for them to do more than they're already at. And so I think that there's a lot that our side will be able to do over the next 2 years, 4 years. Yes, it will take time, but I think you're going to start to see a lot more popular YouTube shows, a lot more content creators building a following, having a cultural impact, and having that significance on our society in a way that Republicans were able to do with people like Joe Rogan and Theo Von and these networks. And so I'm optimistic on that front. And I think that there will be so many more people who will be raising their voices and who will be creating shows that will have funding and that will be able to break through in a way that we couldn't before because of sort of where the conversation with new media is. And so I'm optimistic. I think the thing that in the sort of short term, though, is just find community. I think finding people who, reconnecting with people, finding in-person opportunities. Gloria Steinem has been doing these really awesome things, which I think they're called free will gatherings. And, if they don't have to be political, but like doing a dinner party or hosting some sort of event at your house, just building community again, and then talking about the ideas with your families, with your friends, and just coming back together, I think is so important because we're in a dark place, I think, in America right now, where loneliness and alienation rates and isolation rates are at all time highs, and we want to build that sense of community back up. And so I think that if we can find a way back to each other in the short term, and then of course get back in the fight once the new year starts, once the inauguration kicks in and the new administration comes in, that's when we start fighting again. But it's okay to sort of step back in the holiday seasons and just to find each other again and to build that sense of community and to think, what's next for each of us and to sort of have that purpose back in mind.
I'm so glad you said that because I think a lot of people are looking for action items and want to hop back into it right away. And I always urge people to build that inner peace. People talk about protecting your peace, and I'm like, no, you got to build that peace so you have peace to protect.
Absolutely. Yes.
But
Yes.
also, if you build that peace and you can show, like, hey, there are no liberal tears here for you to stoke and trigger, eventually those bullies recognize working and we can actually hone in on the things that nourish us as opposed to constantly being on the defensive. And so I have made an effort to talk to strangers in ways that I have not before, looking for that community and reconnecting with friends because for a lot of us, especially who are in it, it feels like in ways politics can be our entire personality. And
Yeah. Yeah.
don't think that's the case. I think it's that we care so much that we want to do everything we can and check all the boxes and make sure we're making America livable and the world livable for as many
Totally.
as possible. And so, but that can lend itself to burnout. And so, and I think that includes the people who are watching right now, because if we're engaged and we're watching these shows still right now after the election, as opposed to saying, I'm just going to go shopping, that
Yeah.
means you're probably one of the people who are prone to burnout. So yeah, I like the idea of building community, and from there we can grow because
Yeah.
there is time. And I think the environment, I want to talk about this really quick before we wrap.
Yeah. Yeah.
The environment will change in the work that we do because we're going to start to see real time repercussions, that
Yeah.
darkness. And I think, I would love to hear what your thoughts are because it has the potential to be further crushing, right? And to send people further in a downward spiral, or it has the potential to be a wake up call like, oh, we've
Yeah.
actually now really hit rock bottom. So can you talk about maybe what your thought is on that, and what we might be able to do to stave it off if you do think we're headed for a crashed out rock bottom, never get out of the fetal position again?
I mean, there will definitely be. I don't even want to think about sort of what's going to happen in this administration because I think you mentioned that during the episode, it's going to impact vulnerable communities in the worst ways possible. I mean, this is going to have such large repercussions across America that I don't think we're quite prepared for. You look at the people who he's appointed to the cabinet positions. I mean, they have records of dismantling things that people care about and that matter to so many lives. And I'm thinking specifically of the people who are in rural areas that voted for Trump. I mean, it's the people who are small business owners who won't end up having immigrants as workers now, and who will end up, sort of in a position where they don't have the support they need, or people who need the support from the federal government. I mean, red states actually rely on the federal government the most compared to blue states, and so it's going to be really dark, I think, for a lot of people. But in that, I think, like you said, there's going to be darkness. And the vice president spoke about this during her acceptance speech the day after the election. There is light too in darkness, I think. And I think there will be a lot of new voices who are going to shed light on their stories and what's happening in their communities. And I think that that again, it gives me optimism in a way, even though that it's not the sort of path that we want to take to get there. But I think a lot of people are going to be impacted. People are going to wake up that, like, this is reality. The people who voted for Trump, the people who didn't, vote in this election, they will realize just how many consequences there are in this election. And I think it's going to shock a lot of people to participate in 2025, hopefully in 2026 and 2028. And I think, if Republicans promise what they're promising, it's going to be a really big backlash, I think, from people who didn't really get involved in this election, or people who didn't quite, were sort of on the fence and voted for Trump and didn't quite know what to expect. I think those voters especially are going to find out. And all we can hope for is that they sort of have a change of mind, a change of heart, and come over to our side.
Yeah, I hope as well because it is a wake up call. So it will
Yeah.
be a wake up call, and it's like if you weren't woke before, you're
You will be awake now.
you will be awake now. And so thank you for that optimism. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for the work that you do tirelessly. I've been following you for a long time now. We've had
Oh,
conversations many times over the years, and you always bring such a clarity to the moment. And that is so needed right now. And so I'm incredibly incredibly grateful for your voice, and I hope you take more time to rest as you're preparing for your next big thing, which I'm assuming will be in communications because that's what you crush at. But please take the time that you need, and then come back and hang out with us on the show again soon. I'd love to have you back.
Will do. Well, I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks again for all the work that you do too.
All right, thanks, Victor. Well, y'all, I think it's really important that we go into this holiday season remembering that it is community that is going to sustain us, that it is our own sense of optimism that is going to sustain us, and we can build from there. And so, please do that for yourself. I know I am going to do that. We have an incredible show for you next week. Very excited about that. We have an author that we're going to be talking about with Christian nationalism. So maybe that's not as optimistic as I would like it to be, but I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. And as always, I will do it in a way that makes us feel like we actually are empowered to make a difference, as opposed to, like I said earlier, curling up into fetal position and crying, because that's not going to do anybody any good, as much as we would perhaps like to do that. So thank you for being with us here today. Make sure to follow me, Maya on Stage, all the platforms, Resolute Square, all the platforms, and share this if it's been helpful for you. Drop the link in the group chat. So yeah, I've been Maya May. This has been Punching Up with Victor Shi, and we'll see you next week.